You're listening to Pen&P Pals, Tabletop Role-playing Radio Theatre. War creeps from the west, threatening a quiet countryside town. While most folk prepare to upend their lives and flee from the conflict, one lone mercenary moves toward it. It's early in the morning. Retribution washes her face, then looks toward the mirror. What does she see? How does she feel? What's the last thing she did before sleeping?
Protruding from a wet tussle of dark Viridian hair, there are two broad horns. They run almost parallel to the surface of her skull. They arc gently up, then back down, splitting into two splayed points at the end. Retribution feels fine, all right even. Her shoulders are healing nicely. A night-long soak in the tub helped with the pain. A weighty chunk of uncut emerald bought her the inn's washroom for the duration of her stay. She had filled the small furnace that warms the tub with fresh timber. She fed it enough to get it warm, and then just kept feeding it. First enough to last through the morning, then enough to boil most folk. Retribution, though, she's a tiefling. Her skin's the color of red brick, and nearly as tough. Without the danger of stewing herself, it didn't take much forethought. She just added logs until the fire looked hot enough. Not taking much forethought. That's important. Yesterday's evening ended after a quick street fight. She pulled both shoulders, dragging half a dozen yokels through the mud. They accused her of cheating at cards. To be clear, she didn't. She was deep enough into a bottle of the house red that fisticuffs seemed like the only real response. They weren't close to a match for her, of course. She just forgot to stretch before the punching started. What in the nine hells? They had a decent look at me, even knew my name. That should be warning enough.
Someone knocks on the door of the washroom, forceful and urgent. A low voice barks.
You still in here? We got other paying folk what need a good bath. Won't come near till you covered up.
The voice drops.
And far off. Wrap it up. It's bad luck seeing something like you out in the daylight. Retribution steps away from the basin. She's at the door in a single stride. It's open now. Crossbow quarrels are launched with less force than that poor slab of wood. Ninjas strain to keep hold of their charge, plaster cracking hysterically as the doorframe tries to flee the scene. Her core is dark, silhouetted by the morning sun. Her thin red wings stretch broadly, casting red light into the hall. She brings her long tail down with a purposeful crack.
Dead. His laughter dies in his throat. The man knew of fiends. Tales told in bars and on piers, passed from parent to child, from friend to friend. He knew that they were mighty and terrible. Fell lords that suspend their ash-black keeps on lakes of molten glass, held up by little more than vile utterances. They plan the destruction of mortal kin as they sit atop thrones cushioned with man-flesh. He knew that to behold one was death. He now knew that he knew nothing of fiends, except that which was glowering and smoldering above him. Awful, beautiful, excruciating death.
Excuse me, her low voice full of indignation, a scarred red hand drawing his collar tight. I'd like to speak to your superior.
Her words are wasted on him. He stares up, dumbfounded, at what he's sure will soon be his awful, beautiful killer.
Where the devil is that boy?
The innkeeper Retribution made arrangements with the night before can be heard scolding her employee from afar. It grows more and more fierce as she stomps up the hall. Seeing the two of them, she loses steam. After a moment, she tears her eyes away from Retribution's nakedness, away from the demon holding her scullery boy 2.5 feet off the floor by his collar, and begins to spout.
Miss, I'm so very sorry about the quality of the wake-up call you ordered.
The innkeeper inhales sharply, a short, distracted gasp.
And the lack of breakfast! If you would be so kind as to release him, I can apply...
She hesitates, stealing an appraising glance toward Retribution. Appropriate disciplinary measures to this simple-minded fool. I would be so very grateful. Her tone is courteous but tight, and now she seems to be holding her breath.
This tiefling wasn't always called Retribution. She took her name after searching the world for a feeling she held above all others. No offense should go unpunished. Explain to me, in detail, your disciplinary plan. Then we'll see if he gets to keep... Her free hand gestures vaguely at the young man's head. This.
Truthfully, my lady, I would let him go if I could spare to. The innkeeper is speaking to Retribution, but she's glaring fiercely at her subordinate. I will be having my barman give him a good thumping. He'll be lucky to handle anything more refined than a chamber pot for the time it takes him to grow some sense. Her temper begins to flare toward the end, but she catches herself. I will ensure he's invisible for the remainder of your stay, my lady.
Retribution releases the man. She looks him in his dumb face and rumbles menacingly. It's much worse luck, seeing something like me after night falls.
The young man clutches his throat and inhales sharply. Then he bolts. He's younger than his tone and attitude would suggest. A fearful glance over his shoulder toward the innkeeper provides some assurance that she'll keep her word.
Don't just beat him. Educate him. He should learn something from this. Hey, if you need to, say I'll drag his soul to one of the nastier hells. If he keeps on treating travelers badly, that is.
The innkeeper doesn't laugh until Retribution does. She excuses herself and bustles out of sight.
Retribution pulls the washroom door free of the plaster wall and closes it. She finishes toweling off, then gets dressed. She gathers her belongings and prepares to leave the inn.
The common room is empty. On a table near the door, Retribution spies a conspicuous parcel. A note is affixed. As way of apology, please enjoy some of our famous half-moon hand pies, some sweet and some savory. Thank you for your stay. It's stamped with a small half-moon in dark green ink.
She drops a few silver pieces behind the bar counter, somewhere the innkeep is sure to find them. For all her anger at the time, Retribution regrets complicating the innkeeper's mourning. The silver should at least pay to have the washroom door repaired. Today's session of P&P Pals brought to you by...
Stop. Halt. Be still. Compulsory acknowledgement. Mandatory appreciation. Each piece a wrought iron work of art. Each piece the essence of acquiescence. By Helen Field Ironworks Caltrops. Today.
Retribution leaves the Half Moon Inn, stepping into the daylight with breakfast in hand. Why is she far enough from home to need an inn? What does she hope to accomplish?
She doesn't have a home. No family, no house, no lands. She's journeyed far and wide as a mercenary, spending much of what she earns to live comfortably between battles. Whatever remains is deposited in the most trustworthy bank she can find in the region. She has modest sums in over a dozen different banks across Kananta. Unfortunately, it all just sits there, gathering dust. Retribution is wise enough to save, but she's unsure of the best way to invest her coin. The plan is to hire someone to do that for her eventually. A conflict is brewing in the west, along the Cinder Strand. She can take her time getting there. The second or third wave of mercenaries usually earn more, and only rarely earn less. But she needs the pay a full-scale war can provide to a warrior like her. If she's ever going to lead her own group of mercenaries, she'll need literal tons of silver, gold, platinum. Seeing the first few dozen hires she makes firsthand wouldn't hurt either. She starts on one of the savory pies, looking for a carriage to take her further west.
The first carriage driver tells Retribution she's headed east. The second is going south. The third isn't actually a carriage, being instead an old wagon pulled by a gray donkey. It is going west, but an old farmer is at the reins. After barely a minute's preamble, he launches into unabashed flirting, explaining that,
"Looks like yours would be better preserved far from war, seeking more earthly, horizontal engagements." Retribution looks more closely at the old farmer. He's practically ancient. His sight must be nearly gone. Perhaps, when it comes to setting up a rowdy grandson, even a devil will do? The conversation drifts from topic to topic before settling on livestock. She explains that much of her childhood was spent wrangling horses and shepherding sheep. If only she could find a docile mare, or maybe an older colt, it could carry her to the next big town.
the older-than-dirt farmer presents a small flaxen satchel. Within are 3 of his best apples. The farmer hands the bag over, saying,
"You might find some wild horse that-a-way, if you insist on getting out west."
Now that Retribution has drawn close in taking the bag, he pauses a moment. From this distance, a faint scar can be seen running the length of his collarbone. It must have been a grisly injury. Sizing her up, he tells of guards coming by looking for recruits every other span. They ship them to the training grounds at Relewin, which is sort of southwest.
"It's a fair bit closer, and you wouldn't need to ride out alone. Wouldn't be nearly so taxing, neither."
After a few minutes more, he says his goodbyes and flicks the reins. The rickety wagon bumps down the road. Nearly out of earshot, but not quite.
Damnation! If I were a younger fellow. Checking her coin pouch, Retribution thinks back to her childhood. She tries to recall a young Alma and the horses she helped raise. Making an offer on one of those beauties with this purse, Alma would have skipped clearly insulted, instead heading straight for mock concern.
Are you addled, ma'am? Did one of our horses kick you in the head on your way over? These are the best horses you'll find this side of the valley. You couldn't buy the milk out of a goat with an offer like that, ma'am.
Walking down a dry western road, she keeps an eye out for wild horses. She may not be able to afford the full mount, but she could swing a bit, bridle, and saddle. Eating another pie, a sweet one this time, she thinks about taking on long-term guard work. If she gives up on her goal, that'd be a fine idea. Beating up drunks, smacking the occasional horse thief around, all while getting enough coin to live a modest life, probably. Her mind drifting now, she pictures the marble dragon chess set she saw in Greyland's Keep. Cut from red marble, the playing surface was smooth, flawless. A perfectly regular square. It contrasted with the base of the board, a bubbling organic mess, deliberately sculpted rivers of red flowing away from the field. Her mind drifts further. The oak and leather armor stand from Brune's Teeth, that glorious spider silk cloak, the one that belonged to the elven countess. Retribution saved her life. She could have asked where the cloak came from, if not for the cloak itself. Further still. How much coin to have those things made new? What would cost more? Acquainting oneself with those possessing such treasures, or the eventual purchase of those treasures? When an object's form speaks ill of its function, does it cost more or less? And further still, how much is a bolt of spider silk? How much is a bolt of cotton, or of hemp? How much hemp does it take to cover a merchant's wares, or a wagon, or a hole in a rampart? Or 100 corpses? What are the costs to repair a house, a town, a castle, an arena? For the nearby countryside, reparations for raised crops, poisoned wells, uninhibited deliberate fatalities. Feeling dampness, Retribution looks down at the crushed mess in her hand. A minute ago, a savory pie, now a gory lump of crust and spiced meat. Easier to chew, she thinks. Today's session brought to you by Storm Giant Grappling Company grappling hooks. Have fun storming the castle.
Use of a rope is highly recommended. Rope sold separately wherever rope is sold.
2 days pass before Retribution happens upon a lone horse. She draws an apple from her satchel.
This horse, it didn't start at her approach, not at all. This could be mistaken for good fortune, but Retribution knows better. This horse, in all likelihood, it isn't wild. Maybe it belonged to some farmer somewhere, but that's ridiculous. He's clearly a charger. More specifically, it looks like a courser, a kind of horse bred for battlefield work. Not some half-mast dandy's overbred destrier. Not that a noble would turn it away. This horse has an outstanding coat, a blue roan with white boots. It's unsaddled, unshod, not behind a fence. She sits on a low, broad rock. She pours the 2 remaining apples from their bag. From her rucksack, she produces a neat square of vellum and a black traveling pen. After that, she slides an onyx scale ring from her right index finger. She won the ring in a tournament. While fetching, it wasn't enchanted or anything. Dropping it into the bag, she takes pen in hand and writes, "World, I accept your fine horse." The vellum, too, goes into the satchel. She ties it tightly closed before casually flicking the bag onto the ground nearby. Ha! Ha! Retribution rides her new horse into a tiny town, looking to buy a saddle.
A guard, wary of her fiendish countenance, assumes her unsaddled horse is stolen property.
Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am. It's awful suspicious for such a nice horse to be without a saddle, ma'am. She indignantly yells him down. Because being harassed on the road and having the saddle stolen off my steed's back wasn't hardship enough for one day.
And he soon walks away, stunned.
Retribution is shaking her head disapprovingly when a petite girl catches her attention. She approaches, holds out a hand, and introduces herself as a niece. What a mixed-up-looking girl. Lovely clothes worn till they're practically falling apart, except for her father's winter coat. She is in noble's posture, but nobody else is with her. Desperate nobles love paying for mercenary bodyguards, whether they really need them or not. She notices a dark tattoo on the tiny girl's wrist, just below her palm. It looks like a tiny dagger, or maybe an arrowhead. Curious. Retribution gingerly shakes Anissa's tiny hand. It's cold, and trembles lightly.
Two travelers meet. They don't yet know it, but their shared destination lies beyond a path of hardship. The music for our intro was composed by Walker Williams. We have links to him and his work in the description. P&P Pals is adapted from a 5th edition D&D play-by-post campaign and has been dramatized for your enjoyment. The show is produced by Precarious at Best and heard by you. See you again, stalwart traveler.